Would you open your Bibles with me, please, to Ephesians chapter 5? And I don't know if you can see very well from there, but there's a couple of very strange things about this photo and this picture up here. One, you'll notice that today we'll be in Ephesians chapter 5. We'll start at verse 33 and work our way back to verse 21. So it's backwards day. Correct. I'm good. Thank you. It's backwards day here at the church. So, and you'll understand, I hope, the reason for that. But I wanted to show you this picture of my dad. And those of you that are experienced enough in watching television and movies might recognize that he looks a little bit like Gabby Hayes in this photo. He actually looks like the photo of his father that his father did that looked just like this when he was trying to look like Gabby Hayes. And so eventually there will be another photo when I can afford a gun like that so that I can look like Gabby Hayes. And most of you are sitting there saying, who in the world is Gabby Hayes? Well, this Father's Day, you should call your grandpa and watch Gabby Hayes movie or something. You know what I'm saying? That goes back a ways, which is why it's in black and white. The other thing that you should know about this photo is this photo ran as a poster at our church in Rapid City. It was a poster about a nursery remodel. My father was a chairman of the property committee. So if you had an opinion about the nursery remodel, this is the guy they wanted you to think about giving your opinion to. And that 6-shooter was usually loaded. Okay, so that was the idea there. And I put that up there for a few reasons. It's Father's Day. And I'm doing my best to recover from that video we watched earlier, like that one with that guy with that voice, like Jake. I don't know if you can make me sound like that, but I want to sound like that from now on when I preach. But also, I'm just still trying not to cry and leak, because that was a tough one. Because right in the middle of that video, I get a text from my daughter. Happy Father's Day, Daddy. Manifest Holy 2.0. And if we get lucky, maybe even 3.0 today. Huge thank you to Chris for filling in. Thank you so much. We really thought we had our house sold. I was so excited. Didn't happen. Still working on that. Hopefully it happens this week, but we'll see. I want to start at the end of this chapter, which is really just a continuation of last week's message. And if you remember right, there was this idea presented by Paul in the first half of the book that just says the gospel changes everything. And then the second half of the book, we've been looking at the implications of that change and what that looks like. And today we're going to see that in a few different types of relationships. We're going to start on the relationship between a husband and wife. And if we can get through that without any shots fired, we may go on to talk about the relationship between parents and children and employers and or slaves and their masters. Same thing in most places in today's world. But Ephesians chapter 5, let's start at verse 32, actually. I want us to start at the end today so that we can better understand what this is about. Because Paul is talking about something very specific here, and I think sometimes we get caught up. Paul has this tendency to chase rabbits, and I love to chase rabbits. As a preacher, I love to chase rabbits, and some of Paul's best material takes place while he's out rabbit hunting. But I don't want us to forget Paul's primary purpose in what we're going to look at today. And so that's why we're going to start at verse 32. He says, this is a profound mystery, but I am talking about Christ and the church. So later today, somebody says, so what did you talk about at church today? You're not going to talk about the fact that women are to submit to their husbands. You're not going to talk about the fact that husbands are to submit to their wives. You're going to say, oh yeah, we talked about the relationship between Jesus and his church. Okay? That's the context for what we're going to learn today. This is not about who should lead a corporation or who should lead a church. This is about Jesus and his love for the church, which is really what this whole book's about. As a matter of fact, the last two words, if you read it in the ESV, it points this out better, but the last two words in his letter are really the words undying or incorruptible love, unending love. Matter of fact, those two words would sum up this book really well. That's what this book is about. We were sinners, destined to hell. And God loved us so much that he brought brand new life into these dead and rotting corpses we've been walking around in. And he gave us a brand new way to live, and it was such an incredible upgrade. And we're going to explore that in the next couple of months. But it's not about we were bad people and now we're better people. No, we were lost people and now we're found people. We were dead people, now we're alive. And this is what it looks like to be alive. And here's what it looks like as a church. We're the target of his affection, of this undying love. And Paul unpacks that by looking at how a husband loves his wife and how a wife loves her husband. And they really do that differently. And some people get confused with that and they think, well, this is about gender roles. And this passage is all about how men and women interact. Here's the thing. I think the reason that Paul does this in this way is because this will shock you. Hold on to your seat. Men and women are different from each other. Yeah. And he knows that, and God knows that, and he knows that we need to be reminded of that. This is a profound mystery. But I'm talking about Christ and the church. However, this is another rabbit trail. Paul says, however, each of you must also love his wife as he loves himself, and the wife must respect her husband. When Paul comes back from rabbit hunting and he says, this is about the church, but by the way, you should love one another just like this. But understand that every illustration has its limitations. When we use an allegory or we tell a story, we usually have a point to make, and sometimes we accidentally make other points that maybe aren't accurate or true. A lot of times they're innuendos, miscommunication, misunderstanding. Remember the point of this passage. Christ loves his church like a husband loves his wife, like a wife loves her husband. Now let's see that spelled out a little bit better. Let's back up to verse 29. After all, no one ever hated their own body, but they feed and care for their body just as Christ does the church, for we are members of his body. For this reason, a man will leave his father and mother and be united to his wife, and the two will become one flesh. This is a profound mystery. This is the mystery we're talking about. This type of unity in the church that is illustrated by this type of unity in a marriage. It's a profound mystery. You see a couple that's been married for 42 years, and sometimes you get confused about who's who because they are so much alike, like Linda and Leon Hansen, who used to make their own clothing and would sit in the front row of the church in the ugliest matching outfits I'd ever seen in my life. And I couldn't tell who was Linda and who was Leon from the back half the time because they were Linda Leon. You know those folks, right? One of those names doesn't flow without the other. That's the type of family I'm talking about. And that's what Paul's talking about. That's what it's like for the church. There's this oneness, kind of like the oneness of a husband and wife. We'll stop there. I was going to go a lot further into that, but I noticed Lindy's in the room, which means there's children in the room too. So I guess I'll have to temper some of my jokes for today. But this is it. Now he's going to get a little more specific. This is my mom and my dad. This is the affection that they still have for one another. That might be the only time I ever saw that affection for one another displayed in that way. It was more often with mom with a rolled up fist like this, because my dad is a guy, a lot like me, deserving more of this than... And yet mutually they love one another and they have a oneness that we hardly understand. Each one of you must love his wife as he loves himself, and the wife must respect her husband I think it's interesting that that's how Paul points it out, because what that does right there, it's not so much to me about position. It's about need. You remember at the beginning of the book, not of Ephesians, but of the Bible, when everything is so good, God creates everything and it's good. He creates sun, moon, sky, star, all of it. It's all good. And then he gets to Adam and it's very good. And the very first thing that is not good in the world, it's not spiders or snakes or gators. It's a man alone. I discovered that on my trip. It is not good for a man to be alone. It's still true today. I'm driving down. It's about a 13-hour trip. And I invested 20 in mine. And that wasn't a hotel room. I don't think I'll ever be able to give my wife that look again when she says, "Do you really want to push it?" when the gas light comes on in the car. I had a fabulous trip, except for about 7 miles of it, spread out over 2 circumstances. So the third time I ran out of gas, technically I didn't run out of gas because it was at the pump in Silsbee. And so I was able just to fill it. But the light came on as I turned my way into the pump. The time before, I wasn't quite so lucky. I had just gone through, I got on to I think it's called the Indian Nation Turnpike or something like that in Oklahoma. Some of you have been there. Turns out that that's kind of a mountainous region. I'd never driven on that road before. But when I asked the guy where the closest gas station was, he said, well, there is one about, a quarter mile away, but you'll have to pay the toll 3 times to go to that station. My wife would have said, pay the toll 3 times. I said, well, how far is it to the next station? He says, oh, it's like 5-10 miles, something like that. It can't be that far. A smarter guy might have said, well, are there mountains between here and there? I'm pulling a trailer. But I wasn't that smart. I just got almost to the top of the hill. And if I could have went 1.5 miles farther, I would have made it to Hugo, which would have been a good thing at 11:30 at night on the Indian reservation that I don't know anything about. It's probably a safe area. Maybe it's not even a reservation. I didn't know where I was. I just knew it was really, really dark, and I didn't want to walk it because I didn't know where I was or what I was doing. So I just waited. I called AAA for the second time that day. I said, I'm out of gas. I did it on the app, and it said they will be there in 54 minutes. I'm like, okay, I can wait 54 minutes. I could use the rest. I'm 2.5 inches off of this interstate. I'll be okay. I've got my hazard lights on. Well, about 45 minutes later when I woke up, my hazard lights were dead and were not going because my battery was dead. And it was pretty dark, and so I'm sitting there thinking, well, maybe I ought to call back. So I called AAA, and they said, well, we'll have a dispatcher or a driver call you and tell you how far out they are. I said, that'd be great because it said they would be here 15 minutes ago. That means I had been waiting 1 hour and 20 minutes after I humbled myself enough to make the call to AAA instead of walking the 1.5 miles I should have walked. But anyway, so I'm sitting there, and about a half hour later, I call the state trooper because I learned that, when you stall in the middle of a highway and fall asleep in the middle of the day waiting for AAA to come to you, that sometimes people call the sheriff thinking that you died in that intersection. And so earlier in the day, when the sheriff came and knocked on the window and said, hey, you're alive, they were so good to me. She even gave me a bottle of water and called a tow truck that made it out before the AAA guy ever. Actually, they called the AAA guy earlier in the day and said, hey, get out there. He said, well, I'm at lunch, Well, I don't care if you're at lunch. This guy's in the middle of the highway. People are calling in thinking he's dead. So I thought, well, I'll try that. So I called 911. They said, what's your emergency? I said, I don't know if it's an emergency. I'm stranded along the interstate in a black vehicle. It's pitch black outside. I'm about 2 inches off of there, and my battery is now dead because AAA hasn't brought me gas yet. And she said, that sounds like an emergency to me. Let me put you through to the state patrol. So they put me through to the state patrol, and they said, well, state patrol is busy right now. They're about 4 miles away from you dealing with an accident. I'm like, could you send them after that accident? Because I think that they'll make it before AAA is going to get anywhere near me. Sure enough, I never got a call back from AAA. Not a single phone call back, not a call from the dispatcher or the truck driver. So anyway, that call to the state trooper turned into another call about 2 o'clock in the morning. I said, I've been sitting here almost 3 hours, and I'm thinking I'm a road hazard. Could you send somebody, please? And they said, yeah, we'll dispatch somebody locally. 15 minutes later, husband and wife show up. They'd been just a few miles down the road cleaning up some gravel somebody spilt in the highway. Hey, yeah, don't call AAA. Not in the South. They don't come. Call us. So I tried to pay them for the gas. They wouldn't take any money for the gas. They wouldn't take anything for their time out or anything, And I'm like, well, would you at least buy her a pancake when you get home or something? Because by now it's 3 o'clock in the morning. And so that's a long story to tell you that I understand when God said it's not good for a man to be alone. It's not good for a man to be alone, because my wife would have kept that story from ever taking place. And you have a lot of those because I hear you laughing. And so when God says, women love him and respect him, there's a reason for that. And when it says, men, love her like you love yourself. Well, let's keep, I'll get to this story in a minute, but let's start at verse 25 now and work our way forward a little bit. Husbands, love your wives just as Christ loved the church and gave himself up for her to make her holy, cleansing her by the washing with water and through the word, and to present her to himself as a radiant church without stain or wrinkle or any other blemish, but holy and blameless. Remember, this whole message is about the church, Christ's love for the church. But you have people who build entire theologies on the idea that a woman can only be saved through her husband. And that's not what Paul is talking about. He wants men to love their wives like Christ loved the church. And we'll talk about those three loves in just a minute. Verse 28. In the same way, husbands ought to love their wives as their own bodies. He who loves his wife loves himself. After all, no one ever hated their own body, but they feed and care for their body, just as Christ does for the church. For we are members of his body, and for this reason a man will leave his father and mother and be united to his wife, and the two will become one flesh, and this is a profound mystery. But I'm talking about Christ and the church. However, each one of you must also love his wife as he loves himself, and the wife must respect her husband. Here's the funny thing. I know that Paul is choosing his words carefully here, and I'm not sure that I've ever understood just how carefully he was choosing them until I really started thinking about this passage about Christ's love for the church. He's trying to explain to husbands and wives in their unique language about this. And so here's how I know that. He doesn't say in here, wives, love your husbands like you love your own bodies. You know why that is? I have yet to meet a woman who gets out of the shower, walks by the mirror, and says, man, I am looking good today. But I've been in a lot of locker rooms with guys who love to stand there and think, I just get better looking every day. And they were pretty ugly to begin with, and the truth is everything's flowing downhill, but they still think, I still got it. And you know what she thinks when she sees that mirror? Maybe it's time to change that mirror out. It's lying to me, Paul's using the language. Men, treat your wife the way you treat yourself. Here's the deal. Most men are narcissists. They love themselves. And they treat themselves better than they treat their family sometimes. And Paul speaks into that and says, men, you need to love your wife and your children the way you love yourself. Put their needs ahead of yours. He's speaking to men in a language that men can understand. So in here, he talks about three types of love. Let's work them backwards since it's backwards, eh? One of them is he says, love this woman like you love your own body. That's self-love. And if a man doesn't get it that way, then he talks about this idea of like a sanctifying love, where he uses this illustration. of, Christ loved the church, the point that he has changed the church, which is what Manifest Holy 1.0 that Chris preached on last week was all about. That Christ loved the church enough to not leave us the way that we were, but to make changes in us. He saved us and he has transformed us. He is making us into something new. He's not leaving us the way we were. So I'm still trying to learn Texas. I'm still trying to learn phrasing from the South. And let me give you an idea how hard that is. Nebraska. Like if you were to go north and to live in Nebraska, we used to have this fantastic slogan forever, the good life. It's like, well, what's good in Nebraska? It's a flyover state, right? And you talk to people and it's like, why do you live in Nebraska? It's like, I don't know, clean food, clean air, clean energy, lots of space, good water. It's a good life. So somebody paid millions of dollars and they had a competition to try and come up with a new slogan. And you know what they came up with? Did you see this a couple of years ago? It made it around the country. It made it famous. Here was the slogan. Nebraska, it's not for everyone. Right? Like, what does that even mean? But it caught a lot of attention. It's kind of like when South Dakota, my home state, they came up with this slogan. They were trying to keep people from doing meth. And so they came up with the slogan, meth, we're on it. What? They meant they were fighting it, but I don't think that's how it communicated. And I'll tell you what, it caught people's attention. Husbands, love your wives, just as Christ loved the church, gave himself up for her to make her holy and cleansing her. You know what? Christ gave himself up to make us into something we weren't yet, to help us to become not just the best version of us that we could ever be, but to help us to become and experience the reality of how he actually sees us. See, this book of Ephesians, if you read it wrong, you would get the idea that holiness is all about our activity. It's about the things we do and don't do. But that's not what this book is about. This book is about our identity as believers. It's about who we are becoming in Jesus Christ. It's about who we are as how God sees us. And you know how he sees the church, all of us in this family of believers? He sees us as something that we can't even begin to imagine ourselves becoming. And I wonder, wives, how would you like to have a husband that looked at you that way and put you and loved you in that position where he says, I'm going to love you and help you become God's best for you. I want you to experience God's best vision of your life. And that's the sanctifying love. Not that I myself can make you holy, because I don't know a man that could make a woman holy except Jesus Christ. The third type of love we see is actually talked about right up above that. We're getting to the beginning of the message. Verse 22, wives, submit yourselves to your own husbands as you do to the Lord. For the husband is the head of the wife, as Christ is the head of the church, his body, of which he is the Savior. Now, as the church submits to Christ, so also wives should submit to their husbands in everything. Husbands, love your wives, just as Christ loved the church and gave himself up for her to make her holy, cleansing her by the washing with water through the word, and to present her to himself as a radiant church without stain or wrinkle or any other kind of blameless or blemish, holy and blameless. We'll just pause there because I've been reading that a few times if you haven't caught up. But do you see the context of it? There's this third type of love. It's really the one he mentions first. He says, husbands, love your wives like Christ loves the church with sacrificial love. He gave himself up for the church to become what the church has become. And he's talked about that in the first 3 chapters. Women, how would you like to have a husband that loves you sacrificially, willing to give up himself, his needs, his dreams for you. Not that you'd ever ask him to do that, but a willingness to do that. Who says, I'm willing to submit myself to you sacrificially. I'm willing to give up. I'm willing to submit with a sanctifying type of love. Like, I will love you in a way that makes you better. And I'm willing to love you more than I even love that guy I see in the mirror every day. And Paul gets real specific. He shares those three types of love and spells it out for us men, in part because we need it spelled out for us. With women, he's more simple. He just says, women, wives. He doesn't even say women. He says, wives, to your husbands as to the Lord. Ironically, people make a huge deal about this verse and that word submit that doesn't even show up in the text. If you were to read the literal Greek version of this, it's wives to your husbands as to the church. Now it shows up further down in this passage about submission because the whole thing is about submission and how we submit to one another. But God knows wives too. Wives, submit yourselves to your own husbands. Now that word's there. Own. Wives, be to your husband. Be true to him. Be faithful to him. Believe in him. For the husband is the head of the wife, as Christ is the head of the church, his body of which he is the Savior. Now the church submits to Christ, so also wives should submit to their husbands in everything. This part's tough to understand, and it's hard to preach. And it's part of the reason I chose not to really preach about gender roles today, because that's not what this is about. Do you remember what this passage is about? When somebody asks you later, what did you talk about at church? What are you going to say? We talked about how Christ loves the church. Like a husband loves a wife and like a wife loves a husband. And in that illustration, you can only go so far with that illustration because Paul only went so far with it. God only takes it so far. But just like Paul communicated clearly to husbands about loving their wives, he communicates to wives about loving their husbands. As the church submits to Christ, so also wives should submit to their husbands in everything. This could be really offensive, especially in our culture, if it weren't for verse 21. You throw verse 21 out of this text, and I don't know if I want to be a part of that church where husbands rule over their wives. But Paul starts this whole thing with submit to one another out of reverence for Christ. And he's talking about the church, and he's talking about marriage. And he uses this illustration of how a woman submits to her husband. You know, I'm glad that he said that, because here's the thing. This is not so much about, in my opinion, a man having the total authoritarian style of leadership in the home, which is what I was raised up believing. This is about God speaking plainly to women, because here's the thing. We don't like to admit it, women, but you're prettier than us. You're smarter than us. You're more invested than us in family stuff. The bottom line is you are so much better than us at everything family that you could do it on your own, and 90% of the time you do. And that's sad. Men have to be reminded, sacrifice, sanctify. The way you love yourself, love your wife. It has to be spelled out that deeply. Women just need to be told, women, let him engage choose, by the way, this is the key part of submit. Submission is a volitional matter. It's a choice. You know what this doesn't say that churches get confused all the time? This does not say, men, you're in charge of the women. It's wives, submit to your own husband. Husbands, mutual submission. You submit to her in a way that is sacrificial, in a way that builds her up. Love her like you love yourself. All to give us a better understanding of what church is. So here's another illustration from Nebraska, because again, I'm trying to learn your illustrations and I'm trying to learn the vernacular. I'm just not there yet. But we have this city in Nebraska that gets famous a couple of times a year and maybe a couple of times a decade, and that's Omaha. Right now, it's the College World Series going on in Omaha. A week ago, it was the Olympic swim trials in Omaha. And Omaha came up with this way that says, we're going to invite people in and show them the good life. It's not for everyone, but we're going to show them the good life, and we're going to show off once in a while. And they put up all these signs around Omaha, and you know what it says? We don't coast. Which to most people, especially those that live on a coast, is their whole big question anyway. Why would you live anywhere without a coast, right? 80% of the country wants to live by a body of water, so we can wish we had a chance to go there once in a while, right? Everybody wants to be by the lake or by the ocean or all that, but in Omaha, they're just proud that they don't coast. I've tried to take that motto for myself. As a father and as a husband, don't coast. And I really think when Christ puts this reminder out there for women, for wives, your husband is ahead in this family. I look at it as not large and in charge, but fully engaged. Can you imagine a body without a head? You know, your body will work without most of its parts. But the head's essential. It's an essential part. And understand what Paul did not say. Paul did not say, okay, so men are the head and women are the liver, which is also an essential organ, by the way. That's not what he said. He's trying to help us understand the essential connection between Christ and the church. And certainly in terms of authority, Christ is the authority over the church. But I think this is not just about authority, it's about deep connection. And if I could paraphrase it, I might have put in there, husbands don't coast. Because here's what I've seen too often. Too often, men will take a position of authority as opposed to a position of servant, sacrificial love in the family. And that's not biblical. If I could encourage fathers with one thing today, I'd just say be engaged with your family. Be a critical part of this family. Don't coast. Fully engage, sacrifice, build her up, love her like yourself. That thing that says to you, I'm off work. I'm going to grab something cold and kick back in the recliner because I worked hard today. You know what? She did too. Don't coast. Love her. Give her something cold once in a while and put her up in the chair and tell her to put her feet up. Husbands, love her like that. Well, the bottom line, the beginning of the message is simply this: mutually submit to one another out of love. As a church, it's a pretty good model for the family too, Paul says, and he chases that rabbit a long way. I think I have time for a second sermon today, so just stay put. Told you I might not preach the second sermon, but if I don't preach it now, I've got to figure out where else to preach it. So I want to finish this chapter because Paul will go on to talk about some other relationships, and we're going to cruise through that. Go to the beginning of chapter 6. This one will preach forward instead of just backwards. At the beginning of chapter 6, there's this admonition to children. It says, children, obey your parents in the Lord, for this is right. And let's just say, If you remember earlier in the book, we're all children of God. Earlier in the book, that's one of the things that we're taught is that we're children of God. So who is Paul talking about when he talks about a child here? Do you have a hand? Raise it. You ought to honor your parents. Whether you're two, like if you're going to ride an airplane, you know what age you move from childhood to adulthood on an airplane? 2. You got to buy a seat if you're over 2 years old to ride on an airplane. How many of you think of as a 2-year-old as an adult? I don't, but they do. But you're a child if you're 2. For the sake of not working our way all the way up the food chain, let's just say this. You're a child if your parents are still paying for your insurance. You're still a dependent in some way, shape, or form. Okay, 25, 26, something like that. We'll just go there for now. And so when Paul says, children, obey your parents in the Lord, for this is right, honor your father and mother, which is the first commandment with a promise so that it might go well with you and they may enjoy long life on the earth. Let's talk about that. Children, I just got one word for you today, honor. But that's a tough word, whatever your age is. How do we honor our parents? Well, here's a few ideas for you. I was thinking about this. First thing I would just say is this disclaimer. You know what Paul doesn't say here? Children, understand your parents. He doesn't say that about husbands and wives either. Husbands, understand your wives. It can't be done. Some things just can't be done. Paul knows that. God knows that. You're not going to understand your parents, kids, but you know what you can understand is your parents love you. Here's a suggestion, Mom, if you're having a tough time, you're looking for creative ways to discipline your children. We saw this video before our kids were born. We went to Lamaze, and they showed us a picture of a child being born. You want to come up with creative discipline for a 10-year-old boy? Show him that video, Mom. Say, this is what I did for you. It's the modern day version of I brought you into this world and I can take you out. It's like, really? This is how you came into the world. Hopefully, men, you didn't video that exact process. You're not going to show that movie. But a child watching it, like, holy cow, you went through that. It'll change the way they look at you for their teenage years. That may not be the best idea, but maybe this would be a better way. You don't have to understand. You need to do this. You need to obey. Paul gets real specific about that. Just obey your parents. That's one of the best ways you can honor them. Obey them. And can I just say that it's a radical lifestyle, the lifestyle of obedience. We just brought back these middle school students who were charged to be kingdom workers. And when they get to high school, they're going to be charged to consider investing their lives in kingdom purposes. They're going to be challenged, and some of them are going to go off to different countries. They're going to go serve in Iraq, and they're going to go serve in Afghanistan. They're going to go serve in China. They're going to serve all over the world as kingdom workers. And that sounds really radical. But to be honest with you, this generation that I totally respect, they love to go be kingdom workers and difference makers in the world. There is an intrinsic joy in this generation that this generation gets from radical service, and it sounds like a radical thing. You want to know what a radical obedience to Jesus Christ, what it means to follow Jesus as a child? Try this one. Obey. That 4-letter word, obey your parents. You don't have to understand them. Try obeying them. And Paul points out that, the scriptures commanded it. Honor your father and your mother. You ought to do that, kids. Honor your father and your mother. You know what will happen if you do that? Your life will change. For example, Paul says it's going to go well with you. This one has a reward for it. It's an immediate reward. You don't have to wait 30 years to experience the joy that comes from obedience. Your parents will look at you like, whose kid is this? When you start to obey. Now, some of you, you've been good at that your whole life. I'm sure Like Chris said last week, there's certain things, we don't have problems with in this church. We don't have problems with kids not obeying their parents. That just doesn't happen around here, right? Man, what a great display of discipleship. Let me give you a couple other ideas. So obey, just do it. Here's the second one. Second way to honor your parents. Speak well. Speak to them well, speak about them well. Talk to your parents and talk well with them. I don't know how to demonstrate this to you. I wasn't super good at this as a kid, but I know what the opposite of it is. Like I was in youth ministry for quite a while, 10 or 12 years, and you'd have this kid, and they'd come to the church back. We used to have these things called landlines. On the phone, can I call my parents? And they've just had a spiritual, you've been with them at CIY, it's a total spiritual high. They get back, they use your phone in the office, and mom's going to wait 15 minutes to get the bread out of the oven or whatever she happened to be doing that day. And this is the part of the phone call I hear in my office. Are you kidding? We've been in the car for 15 hours. You want me to wait 15 more minutes to come pick me up? No way, just come send Dad. If you're at that mode of, you're not speaking well to your parents. Talk to your parents in a way that honors God, and you'll be rewarded for it. Here's the third thing. Tell the truth, even when it's hard. Some truths are harder than others to tell. There are going to be times that you feel shame over what you've done. But your parents love you. You have no idea how deeply. Good emphasis there. Thank you for that, Jake. But just speak well of them and tell the truth to them. Some of these things are hard to say. I can't tell you how many families I know that would have benefited tremendously from telling the truth sooner, responding in a more loving way to the truths. Speak truth and do it as quickly as possible. Well, we're done picking on kids, but I want to talk about you adult kids out there. If you're fortunate enough to be an adult whose kids are, to be a kid whose parents are still alive and you're an adult, I'd encourage you to honor your parents still. How can adult children honor them? How about a phone call, not just on Father's Day, but a just because day? Give your parents a call, and if you really want to throw them for a loop, be grateful. Here's the way a lot of my conversations used to go with my dad when my kids were young. Dad, you're not going to believe what Ian did today. And he's like, oh, let me hear it. I've been waiting for this for 30 years. I was like, I knew one day it would happen to you like it had happened to me. You're not going to believe what he did. Yeah, you did the same thing, remember? Yeah, but that was me. So call, show gratitude for all that stuff that they did, all those times that they should have killed you and didn't. And third, ask their advice. That guy with the pistol that I showed you, he never pulled that on me as a kid. At least didn't point it at me, There were several times he probably should have. But his version of church leadership was he was the guy that took care of the building stuff. Whatever needed done, he was the guy that came in and did it. We have those in the church. You don't survive as a church without that person around, right? You know what he didn't do? He was never an elder in a church. But he mentored a lot of people. There's a lot of men. Looked at my dad as a father. And they honor him more than I did. Troy used to live next door to us. I'll tell you a lot of stories about Troy someday. But Troy didn't have a dad. So he just adopted my dad. My dad wasn't all that interested in raising Troy, but every opportunity Troy had, he was there with my dad after I was gone. Garth was my dad's son in the church. Ray was my dad's son in the church. And those guys will call him today and wish him a happy Father's Day. Sorry, I'm a little emotional. Probably from running out of gas too many times and not getting enough sleep. But we need that in the church. And here's what I was going for in this point. Call, thank, but also ask. You know how many times over the years I've called my dad and I've said, hey, Dad, I was thinking about buying this car. My dad was terrible at buying cars. Finally, he told me that when I was like 30 years old. He just said, I don't know why you always call me about cars. Don't you remember? I was no good at it. He was honest. I'd call and tell him about the church, things going on in the church. Dad, what would you do? Well, I wouldn't lead a church. That's what I would do. I wouldn't lead a church. It's hard. That's why I was never an elder. There's a reason I said no. I wasn't worthy. That was the way he felt. He was worthy. He just didn't want the position. Or the title, I should say. He was willing to do the work, just didn't want the title. You know what kept him from being an elder? He didn't think an elder should smoke. And he kept battling that addiction for years. It made him feel unworthy. And yet he was an elder in that church, so many men that he raised up over the years. So that's how an adult child can honor their parents or their fathers. I picked fathers specifically for that moment because it's Father's Day, I suppose. Let's go back to the text. Before the hail falls and you can't hear anything. Fathers, verse 4. By the way, this does not say parents, even though in the footnote it says parents. Specifically, he's talking to fathers on this one. And I think it's not because he thinks mothers should exasperate their children. I think it's because he knows that fathers do exasperate their children. And he says, fathers, don't exasperate your children. Instead, bring them up in the training and instruction of the Lord. By the way, women do that. They train them. They bring them up. They raise them. Fathers need to be reminded to get engaged, to get out of the chair and get engaged in that family. Don't coast. Fathers, don't exasperate your children. This one's hard for me because it hits home a lot. I love to tease my kids. My kids will tell you that one thing that they remember about their dad is he didn't have a serious bone in his body because I was always trying to be that guy. I suppose because I'm the youngest, the class clown kind of guy. But children need a dad who understands their needs. And a dad that exasperates your children. What's the word exasperate? Maybe you use that in Texas. Maybe it's like a y'all thing, but we don't use that word in the North. So I had to look it up. You know what it means? Here's the best way I can describe it. It means don't put your kids in a no-win situation. Now, I know what that is. It's like when I was 4 years old, my mom would try and get me to eat certain foods like Brussels sprouts. Well, you're going to sit there until those Brussels sprouts are gone. And man, my dog loved Brussels sprouts. But they did not love her, That's a no-win situation. Did you eat all your Brussels sprouts? Well, they're gone, aren't they? You said until they were gone, they're gone. Did you feed them to the dog again? Well, you didn't say that. I couldn't do that. I'd find a workaround. But here's the thing. Parents, don't put your kids in that position. A no-win situation. Now, I'm not saying don't teach them how to eat well. I'm saying there are times that we put our kids in a position where there's no way for them to win. Try and get that win. Put your kids in a position where they can win. Help them be successful. Train them up. I just want to make one other comment here. Coach. I love this time of the year. I love to watch baseball. I remember I was a lousy Little League coach. I was, here's how bad it was. So one time we're down the final inning of a game. We are 1 out away from winning this game. And the kid that's at the plate, I don't remember who was pitching, but the kid at the plate from the other team swings full circle, 360 around in the plate. And the ump behind the plate didn't see it. How do you miss that? Well, I'll just say that we didn't have Major League Baseball umpires and we didn't have replay at this. And so his son was umping over on the base, and Lyle calls out to his son and says, Hey, did you see that? Did he swing all the way through? Well, everybody in the crowd knows he swung all the way through. He turned a circle. He didn't see it either. How did you not see it? Well, I wasn't watching. I was like, oh man, I came unglued at this guy, right? Lyle, he swam. I came out. Lyle, I was like the assistant coach. Coach stayed there, where he was at. I was out there. Lyle, how could you see that? How could you not see that? I buried Lyle's dad. I buried his mom. We were good friends. He came to church that next Sunday, and I'm preaching, and he starts heckling me. A good coach coaches outside of the game. I listened to a professional baseball coach describe it this way. Once they cross a white line, it's up to them. My investment in them is done. They got to play the game. I can't play the game for them. Parents who coach their kids, let them play the game. They let them make mistakes. They let them make errors. They don't shout at them from the stands. They don't shout at them from the dugout. They let them play, and then when they come back in, they help correct. But you know what? You have a lot less correcting to do if you coach them along the way, guys. Dads, he says, don't exasperate your children. Instead, invest in them. Bring them up in the training and instruction of the Lord. And I guess the word I would say, like if the word for kids here, the word of the day is something simple like honor, the word for parents, and specifically for dads in this case, I'd have to say it's influence. That's what training and building up is. Dads, influence your kids in the right direction. Bring them up in the Lord. And that's what he's talking about here. Dads, influence your kids for Jesus. Point them to Jesus. And by the way, I'll throw parents in there for that. That's your primary role as parents. Mothers tend to do it a little more by nature than we do. So then he goes on, and he talks about one other type of relationship. Slaves, obey your earthly masters with respect and fear. Again, we're saying, fathers submit to or husbands submit to your wives, right? Slaves, masters. No. He's giving household instructions, and in those days, the household was made up of the family that's related to each other and the people who were hired to serve. And it was common for a family not to have resources, and so they developed indentured servants. We would just simply call these people employees. And this is the third type of relationship that he wants to tell us about as a church. He said, you ought to work as if you're working for the Lord. Look at what he says. He says, obey them not only to win their favor when their eye is on you, but as slaves of Christ, doing the will of God from your heart. Serve wholeheartedly as if you're serving the Lord, not people, because you know that the Lord will reward each one for whatever good they do, whether they are slave or free. And masters, treat your slaves in the same way. Do not threaten them, since you know that he who is both their master and yours is in heaven, and there is no favoritism with him. So finally, we get to the other holiday, Juneteenth. I have to be honest with you. I'm really grateful for that new holiday. I don't know if I'll get it off the church. I don't think it's in my contract at the church. I don't know. Is it in there? I don't think so. But you do. Probably if you're working still, you're going to get a whole new holiday. We were just talking today. Joe was talking that Father's Day is ranked number 20 in holidays, and I can't think of 19 other holidays. Well, one of them is Juneteenth. And I love it, not just because it's a holiday, but it's a reminder to me of something that the book of Ephesians reminds me of. At the end of this book, starting at verse 23, this is the point of this entire series that we've done. Peace to the brothers and sisters, and love with faith from God the Father and the Lord Jesus Christ. Grace to all who love our Lord Jesus Christ with an undying love. That's why Paul wrote this letter, to remind the church of the undying love that God has for each and every one of us. And this Juneteenth holiday, if you haven't read up on it yet, you ought to read up on it. How does it happen that for 2 years, slaves are free and nobody tells them? How does that happen? Now, this passage is actually not necessarily about slavery, because that type of slavery didn't exist in the New Testament. The horrendous slavery, the way that we treated people, that didn't exist in the New Testament. It was an employee type of relationship. But when I read the end of this where it says, peace to the brothers and sisters, and love with faith from God the Father and the Lord Jesus Christ. I hope you don't go another day not knowing the reality of the book of Ephesians and the depth of God's love for you, his people. It would be an atrocity, like Juneteenth. 2 years as a slave without knowing you're free. Don't go another day without knowing the undying love of Jesus Christ for you, church. Let's pray. Father, thank you for your word and the sufficiency of it. I pray, Lord, that you said something to this church today that I couldn't. I pray that you reminded us of your undying love for each and every one of us in our glory and in our frailties. Would you help us to become this kind of church, God? A church that makes the mystery known, that Jesus Christ can give life to those who are dying like he has for us, and that he loves us with an undying love. In Christ's name I pray. Amen.